The glass door of the corner office was open just an inch, and that inch was enough to change everything. Maya Bennett stood frozen in the hallway of Whitfield Logistics, a warm mug of coffee going cold in her hand, listening to her husband's voice carry through the gap. "She's just a liability at this point," Daniel Whitfield said. "I need investors to see me as sharp, independent, someone who built this alone. Maya doesn't fit that picture anymore." The man across from him, Peter Lang, laughed a short, careless laugh. "So what, you're going to cut her out of the pitch deck photos too?" "I'm going to cut her out of everything that matters," Daniel said. "She's slowing me down." Maya did not drop the mug. She did not gasp. She stood very still, the way a person stands when the ground has shifted beneath them, but their body has not yet caught up to the news. 6 years of marriage collapsed into that one sentence. 6 years of covering rent when his first company failed. 6 years of late nights helping him rehearse investor pitches at the kitchen table, circling weak points in his arguments with a red pen, feeding him coffee at 2 in the morning so he could finish a proposal on time. She turned and walked back down the hallway before either man noticed her. Outside, the parking lot was bright with April sun, and Maya sat in her car for a long moment before starting the engine. Her hands were steady. That surprised her. She had expected to shake, to cry, to feel her chest cave in. Instead, she felt a strange, cold clarity, like waking up from a fog she had not realized she was standing in. She thought about the early days, when Daniel was nothing more than an ambitious young man with a business degree and no clients. She had met him at a conference in Denver, where she was working logistics for a mid-sized shipping firm, and he was trying to convince anyone who would listen that he could build something better, faster, leaner. She liked his hunger. She liked that he asked questions instead of pretending to know everything. She had not yet learned that hunger, left unchecked, can turn a person hollow. They married 2 years later in a small ceremony with folding chairs and string lights, and within 6 months, Daniel quit his stable job to start Whitfield Logistics from a spare bedroom. Maya kept her own position and quietly became the financial backbone of their household, paying the mortgage, the insurance, the groceries, while Daniel poured every spare dollar into his company. She never asked for credit. She never asked to have her name on anything. She simply believed in him, the way people believe in things they have decided are worth believing in, sometimes past the point where belief is reasonable. Now, sitting in a parking lot with the engine idling, she understood that belief was not something Daniel had ever returned in equal measure. She drove home on autopilot, replaying moments she had never thought to question before. The dinner 3 years ago when a potential investor visited their house, and Daniel introduced her as my assistant for the evening instead of his wife, laughing it off later as a joke that didn't land. The way he had stopped inviting her to industry events over the past year, telling her the crowd was boring, mostly numbers people, you'd hate it, when in fact she had built half of his early client relationships herself through her old shipping contacts. She had explained away each moment individually. Strung together, they told a different story. At home, she sat at the kitchen table where she had once helped him build his first business plan, and she opened her laptop, not to search for anything in particular, just to have something to do with her hands. Her eyes landed on a folder labeled Household Finances, a folder she maintained meticulously because Daniel had no patience for spreadsheets. She scrolled through years of records, every wire transfer she had made to cover his company's early payroll before the business could support itself. Every personal loan she had co-signed, every unpaid hour she had spent managing his calendar, drafting his emails, smoothing over conflicts with vendors who found him difficult to work with. She was not just his wife. She had been, for years, an unpaid employee, an unlisted co-founder, an invisible hand steering a ship whose captain believed he sailed it alone. Her phone buzzed. A text from Daniel, running late tonight, big meeting with Peter about the Meridian account. Don't wait up. She stared at the screen for a long time before typing back a simple, okay, good luck. It was the last message she would send him without a plan in mind. That evening, Maya called her older brother, Ethan, who lived 2 hours away and worked as a contracts attorney. She did not cry when she told him what she had heard. Her voice was calm, almost businesslike, and Ethan later told her that calm was what worried him most. "Are you sure about what you heard?" he asked. "Context can change things." "I heard him clearly, Ethan. There was no context that changes what he meant." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" Maya looked around the kitchen, at the appliances she had chosen. The small business ledger she still kept out of habit, even though Daniel had hired an accountant 2 years ago and never told her. At the framed photo on the wall of the two of them at the ribbon cutting for his first real office. Her hand on his shoulder. His eyes fixed somewhere just past the camera, already looking toward the next thing. "I want to leave," she said. "Quietly, I don't want a scene. I don't want to give him the satisfaction of watching me fall apart. I just want to go." Ethan did not try to talk her out of it. He had never fully trusted Daniel, though he had kept that opinion mostly to himself out of respect for Maya's happiness. Now he offered something more useful than sympathy. He offered a plan. "Don't do anything tonight," he said. "Don't confront him, don't pack a bag in anger. Give yourself a few days to think clearly. If this is real and it sounds real, you'll want to protect yourself financially and legally before you make a move. I can help you with that." Maya agreed, though something in her had already decided. The decision did not feel like anger. It felt like relief, the kind that comes after holding a heavy object for so long that your arms have gone numb, and you finally understand you are allowed to put it down. Daniel came home after midnight, smelling faintly of the whiskey he drank when he closed a deal, though the Meridian account, Maya would later learn, had not actually closed that night. He kissed the top of her head as she pretended to sleep, murmured something about a long day, and fell asleep within minutes, untroubled, unaware that the woman beside him had already begun quietly building a door out of the life they shared. Over the following days, Maya did not change her behavior in any way Daniel would notice. She made his coffee in the mornings. She listened to him complain about Peter's laziness and the slow pace of new client acquisitions. She nodded in the right places. But underneath the routine, she was watching everything with new eyes, cataloging the small cruelties she had trained herself to overlook. She noticed how he spoke to her only when he needed something. She noticed how quickly his mood turned when a deal fell through, and how she was always the first target of his frustration, absorbing it so it would not touch anyone he considered important. She noticed, with a kind of quiet horror, how thoroughly she had shrunk herself over 6 years to make room for his ambitions, until there was very little space left for her own. On Thursday, she met Ethan for lunch at a small cafe near his office, away from anyone who might recognize her and mention it to Daniel. She brought a folder of financial documents, and together they began mapping out what she would need. A separate bank account, opened quietly under her maiden name. A conversation with a divorce attorney, not yet to file anything, but to understand her rights and protect what was hers. A place to stay that Daniel would not think to look for her, at least not immediately. "You don't have to do this fast," Ethan reminded her, watching her flip through pages with the same efficient focus she once used to organize Daniel's investor decks. "You can take your time." "I don't want to take my time," Maya said. "I've given him 6 years of my time. I want this part to be quick." Ethan smiled faintly, a mixture of pride and worry. "Then let's do it right." That night, driving home under a sky heavy with the promise of rain, Maya passed the exit for Whitfield Logistics' newest office building, a glass structure Daniel had been so proud of when it opened 8 months earlier, funded in part by a loan she had helped negotiate through a contact from her old shipping firm, a favor Daniel had never once acknowledged publicly. She did not feel bitterness looking at the building. She felt something closer to distance, as though she were already watching her old life from a great height, small and manageable, no longer capable of hurting her the way it once had. She thought of the words she had overheard, replaying them not with pain now but with something like clarity. "She's just a liability." Daniel had said it as a plain fact, the way a person describes a broken appliance, something to be discarded and replaced without much thought. He had no idea how much weight she had been carrying for him. He had no idea what would happen when she finally set it down. Maya pulled into the driveway of the house they shared, sat for a moment in the quiet dark of the car, and allowed herself one small, private smile. Not because she was happy. Not yet. But because for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt like she was standing on solid ground, making a decision entirely her own, answerable to no one but herself. Inside, Daniel was on a call in his home office, his voice bright and confident, talking about growth projections and market share. Maya walked past the door without stopping, climbed the stairs, and began in her mind to build the life that would come next. She had no idea yet how completely his world would fall apart once she was gone. She only knew that hers was finally about to begin. The following 2 weeks became, for Maya, an exercise in living two lives at once. By day, she was the wife Daniel Whitfield had always known, calm, competent, quick with a supportive word whenever he needed one. She still packed his lunch on the mornings he forgot to eat before rushing out the door. She still asked about his meetings, still remembered the names of his clients better than he did. None of that was performance exactly. It was simply the shape her love had taken for 6 years, and habits like that do not disappear the moment a person decides to leave. But underneath the routine, a second Maya was awake and working, gathering pieces of a life she intended to build without him. She met Claire Dawson, her closest friend since college, at a bookstore cafe on the edge of town, where neither of them was likely to run into anyone from Daniel's circle. Claire had always been blunt in a way Maya secretly loved, the kind of friend who said the things other people only thought. "You heard him say that? With his own mouth?" Claire asked, stirring her tea slowly, her eyes sharp with disbelief that had nothing to do with doubting Maya and everything to do with disbelief at Daniel. "His own mouth," Maya confirmed. "To Peter, like I was a line item he needed to cut from a budget." Claire set down her spoon. "Maya, I need you to hear me say this clearly. You built that man's confidence back up more times than I can count. I watched you do it. The year his first business folded, you were the one who convinced him to try again. You believed in him when nobody else did, including his own family." "I know," Maya said quietly. "That's what makes it worse." Claire reached across the table and took her hand. "What do you need from me?" It turned out Claire could offer something practical. Her cousin owned a small 2-bedroom apartment near the edge of the city, recently vacated, not yet listed for rent. Claire made a call that evening, and by the end of the week Maya had quietly signed a short lease under her maiden name, using an address Daniel would have no reason to know or search for. She began moving small things there in stages. Nothing dramatic, a box of books here, a set of towels there, always timed for afternoons when Daniel was buried in meetings and would not notice her car gone for an hour. At the same time, she continued her meetings with Ethan, who introduced her to a divorce attorney named Nathan Price, a calm, thorough man who specialized in cases involving business assets tangled with personal finances. He asked Maya detailed questions about her role in Whitfield Logistics, questions that made her realize, answer by answer, just how deeply embedded she had been in a company that did not officially recognize her existence. "Did you ever receive a salary from the business?" Nathan asked, pen ready. "No," Maya said. "I did the work as his wife. It never occurred to either of us to formalize it." "Did you co-sign any loans?" "Two, the first expansion loan, and the loan for the new office building last year." "Did you ever personally transfer funds into the business account?" Maya thought of the folder on her laptop, years of records. "More times than I can count. Payroll gaps mostly in the early years. Emergency vendor payments more recently, when cash flow was tight." Nathan nodded slowly, the kind of nod that told Maya he was building something useful out of her answers. "This matters, Maya. Your financial contributions to that company are documented, even informally. That gives you leverage you may not realize you have." Maya had not been thinking about leverage. She had been thinking about leaving quietly, taking only what was rightfully hers, avoiding the ugliness of conflict. But something in Nathan's careful, measured explanation of her rights shifted the way she saw her own situation. She was not simply a woman walking away from a marriage. She was a woman who had helped build something real, something valuable, and had never once asked for recognition because she had trusted that recognition would come naturally, as a byproduct of love and partnership. It had not come, and now she understood she did not need to beg for it. She could simply document it calmly and let the truth stand on its own. Over dinner one evening, Daniel seemed distracted, scrolling through his phone between bites, occasionally muttering about a client named Olivia Grant who had been slow to sign a renewal contract. "You've barely touched your food," Maya said, watching him with an attentiveness that had become almost clinical in recent days. "Sorry, Peter thinks Olivia's account might walk if we don't move fast. It's a big client. Can't afford to lose it right now, not with the office lease payment coming up." Maya, who 6 months ago would have offered to draft a follow-up email or suggest a personal touch that might win Olivia back, said nothing. She simply nodded and let the silence stretch between them, testing what would happen if she stopped offering solutions to problems he no longer considered her business to solve. Daniel did not seem to notice the change. That, more than anything, confirmed for Maya what she already suspected. He had grown so used to her quiet support that its absence did not register as absence at all. It simply left a gap he had not yet learned to see. There were moments during those 2 weeks when guilt crept in, unbidden and uncomfortable. She would catch herself remembering the good years, the early mornings when Daniel would bring her coffee in bed before either of them had any money to speak of, the way he used to look at her across a room like she was the only steady thing in a life otherwise full of risk. She wondered if she was being unfair, reducing 6 years of a real relationship down to a single overheard sentence. But then she would remember the tone of his voice in that office, so casual, so certain, discussing her value the way a person discusses the resale price of a used car. And the guilt would recede, replaced by something firmer, something closer to resolve. She began, quietly, to separate her financial life from his. She opened a personal account at a different bank, one Daniel had never used, and began redirecting her own paycheck there instead of the joint account they had shared for years. She contacted a former colleague from her days in shipping logistics, a woman named Priya Malhotra who now managed operations for a growing freight company, and mentioned, carefully, that she might be interested in returning to full-time work if the right opportunity came along. "You're a legend in this industry, Maya," Priya said over the phone, her voice warm with genuine enthusiasm. "Half the vendor relationships Whitfield Logistics has were built because of you, whether Daniel likes to admit that or not. If you ever want back in, call me first." Maya thanked her, surprised by how much the compliment steadied her. For years she had folded her professional identity into Daniel's ambitions, telling herself it was a temporary sacrifice, a bridge to something bigger they would build together. Hearing someone else recognize her skill, independent of her marriage, felt like remembering a language she had once been fluent in and had almost forgotten how to speak. Near the end of the second week, Daniel came home unusually early, catching Maya off guard as she sat at the kitchen table reviewing a checklist Nathan had prepared for her. "What's that?" he asked, hanging his jacket by the door, his tone casual, uninterested in any real way. Maya closed the folder smoothly. "Just some paperwork for my sister's estate stuff," she lied, the words coming easier than she expected. "Boring legal things." Daniel shrugged, already moving toward the refrigerator, his mind clearly elsewhere. "Sounds tedious. Let me know if you need help." "I've got it handled," Maya said, and there was a quiet double meaning in the words that Daniel, absorbed in his own world, did not catch. That night after he fell asleep, Maya lay awake staring at the ceiling, running through the plan in her mind one final time. The apartment was ready. Her personal accounts were separated. Nathan had all the documentation he needed to begin building her case if things became contentious. Claire had promised to help her move the last of her things on a day when Daniel would be traveling for a client meeting in another city, a trip that had been on his calendar for weeks. There was only one piece left to settle in her own mind, something Nathan had asked her directly during their last meeting. Did she want to leave a note, some kind of explanation, or did she want to simply be gone, letting Daniel discover her absence and draw his own conclusions? Maya had thought about this longer than anything else. Part of her wanted to write pages, to lay out every grievance, every sacrifice, every moment of quiet cruelty she had absorbed and never spoken of. But another part of her, the part that had grown stronger with every meeting with Nathan and every quiet act of preparation, understood that Daniel did not deserve the gift of her explanation. He had never asked for her thoughts when he decided she was a liability. He did not need to receive them now that she had decided to leave. She would write something simple, something true, and then she would go. Lying beside a man who still had no idea his entire world was about to shift beneath him, Maya closed her eyes and, for the first time in weeks, slept without dreaming of the office door left open just an inch, without dreaming of the words that had once cut so deeply. She dreamed instead of the apartment waiting for her across town, small and plain and entirely her own, a blank page ready to be filled with a story she alone would write. The morning Daniel left for his trip to Chicago, he moved through the house with the same rushed energy Maya had watched for 6 years, checking his phone twice before he had even finished his coffee, muttering about a connecting flight and a dinner meeting with a supplier that evening. "I'll be back Thursday," he said, kissing her cheek at the door, his mind already somewhere over the Midwest. "Don't wait up for my call tonight, it'll probably run late." "Travel safe," Maya said, and meant it in the small, ordinary way a person means well for someone they are about to leave. She was not angry as she watched his car pull out of the driveway. She felt, instead, a strange calm settle over her, the kind of stillness that comes before a long-planned task finally begins. She waited until his car disappeared around the corner before she picked up her phone and called Claire. "He's gone," she said simply. "On my way," Claire answered, already grabbing her keys. By 9 that morning, Claire arrived with her small pickup truck, and the two of them moved through the house with quiet efficiency, the kind that comes from careful planning rather than panic. Maya had made lists weeks earlier, color-coded by room, marking exactly what belonged to her and nothing that did not. She took her clothes, her books, the framed photographs of her own family, a set of dishes her grandmother had given her as a wedding gift, and the laptop that held years of financial records Nathan had already copied and secured. She did not take anything from Daniel's side of the closet, did not touch his desk, did not disturb the framed photo in the hallway of their wedding day, though she paused in front of it for a long moment before Claire gently touched her shoulder. "You don't have to look at it," Claire said quietly. "I want to," Maya answered. "I want to remember it honestly, not erase it, not pretend it didn't happen. Just leave it where it belongs in the past." They loaded the truck in under 2 hours, moving with a rhythm that felt almost ceremonial, each box a small closing of one chapter and opening of another. Maya kept expecting to feel a flood of grief, some collapse of resolve, but instead she felt lighter with every item she carried out the door, as though she had been wearing a heavy coat for years without realizing its weight until she finally set it down. Around noon, she sat at the kitchen table one last time, a blank sheet of paper in front of her, and wrote the note she had been composing in her mind for 2 weeks. "Daniel, by the time you read this, I will have already moved out. I am not doing this out of anger, though I have plenty of reasons to feel it. I am doing this because I heard what you said about me to Peter, and I finally understood that I had spent years giving everything I had to someone who saw me as a burden rather than a partner. I am not asking you to explain yourself. I am not asking for an apology. I am simply telling you that I am gone, and that I will be speaking with an attorney about how to properly divide what we have built together, since a great deal of it, though you may not have realized it, was built with my hands as much as yours. I wish you well, I truly do, but I am done being invisible in a life I helped create. Maya." She read it twice, folded it once, and left it on the kitchen counter, weighted down by the small ceramic mug he always used for his morning coffee. The one she had bought him years ago at a farmer's market during a weekend trip neither of them could really afford at the time, back when they had nothing but ambition and each other. Claire waited by the door, watching her with quiet respect. Ready. Maya took one last look around the house that had been her home for 6 years, at the life she had built inside its walls, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. She did not feel the urge to cry. She felt instead a quiet gratitude for her own strength, a strength she had not fully recognized in herself until circumstances demanded it. Ready, she said. The drive to the new apartment took 20 minutes, though it felt, to Maya, like crossing into an entirely different life. Claire helped her carry boxes up 2 flights of stairs, both of them laughing at odd moments despite the seriousness of the day, the kind of laughter that comes from nervous energy finally finding release. By early evening, the small apartment held the beginnings of a home, boxes stacked neatly against the walls, a mattress set up in the bedroom. The framed photo of Maya's parents already hung crookedly above the small kitchen table. Claire ordered takeout, and the 2 friends sat on the floor eating noodles from paper containers, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, talking about everything except Daniel for the first time in weeks. "How do you feel?" Claire finally asked when the conversation lulled. Maya considered the question seriously before answering. "Scared, excited, sad in a strange, distant way, like I'm mourning something that already ended a long time ago and I'm only now catching up to the loss." She paused, twirling noodles around her chopsticks. "But mostly I feel free. I didn't expect that. I expected to feel broken. Instead, I feel like I can finally breathe." Claire smiled, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "That's because you are free, Maya. You made a choice most people are too scared to make. You didn't wait for him to change. You didn't wait for an apology that might never come. You just quietly took your life back." That night after Claire left, Maya sat alone in her new apartment, the city lights glowing faintly through unfamiliar windows, and allowed herself, finally, to cry. Not out of regret, but out of release, the way a person cries after finishing a long, difficult task they have carried alone for far too long. She cried for the version of herself who had shrunk herself to make room for someone else's ambition. And she cried, too, with a strange kind of hope, for the version of herself she was only beginning to meet. Her phone buzzed twice that evening, both times messages from Daniel, sent from Chicago, unaware of anything happening back home. The first read, "Dinner ran long, supplier seems interested, might have good news soon." The second sent an hour later, "Miss you, see you Thursday." Maya read both messages without responding. There was nothing cruel in her silence, only the simple fact that she no longer owed him the reassurance of an immediate reply. For 6 years she had trained herself to respond quickly to his every message, anticipating his needs before he voiced them. Tonight, for the first time, she let the messages sit unanswered on her screen while she unpacked a box of books, arranging them on a small shelf in an order that pleased no one but herself. She thought briefly about what Thursday would bring, about the moment Daniel would walk into their old house and find it half empty, find the note weighted down by a coffee mug on the counter. She did not know exactly how he would react. Anger, most likely. Confusion, certainly. Perhaps in some distant corner of himself he rarely visited, something like regret. But that was his reaction to manage, not hers. She had spent 6 years managing his emotions alongside her own, absorbing his frustrations, softening his failures, translating his ambition into something the world could tolerate. She was not responsible for how he would carry the news of her departure. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Maya fell asleep without wondering how to help someone else feel better about their day. She fell asleep thinking only of herself, of the small apartment around her, of the life waiting to be built inside its unfamiliar walls. And the sleep that came was deep and undisturbed, the rest of a person who had finally stopped carrying a weight that was never fully hers to carry. 2 states away, in a hotel room in Chicago, Daniel Whitfield fell asleep scrolling through spreadsheets, entirely unaware that the ground beneath his carefully built world had already begun to shift. Quietly, permanently, in ways he would not understand until Thursday afternoon, when he walked through his front door and found the silence waiting for him. Daniel Whitfield's flight landed on Thursday afternoon a little later than planned, delayed by weather over the Midwest, and by the time his car pulled into the driveway of his house, he was already thinking about the next morning's meeting with Peter, mentally rehearsing talking points about the supplier deal he believed was close to finalized. He did not notice, at first, that Maya's car was missing from its usual spot beside the garage. He did not notice the unusual quiet of the house as he walked through the front door, keys jingling in his hand, calling out a greeting that met only silence. It was the kitchen that finally caught his attention. The counter, normally cluttered with mail Maya sorted daily and small notes reminding him of appointments he would otherwise forget, was almost bare, except for a single folded sheet of paper weighted down beneath his favorite ceramic mug. He read the note standing up, still wearing his coat, his travel bag slipping unnoticed from his shoulder to the floor. He read it once quickly, the way a person skims something they assume must be a misunderstanding. Then he read it again, slower, his eyes catching on certain phrases. "I heard what you said about me to Peter. I am done being invisible in a life I helped create." For a long moment, Daniel simply stood in his kitchen, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. Though he would later insist to himself, it was only the draft from the air conditioning. His first instinct was disbelief. Surely this was an overreaction, some misunderstanding he could clear up with a phone call. He pulled out his phone and dialed Maya's number, expecting, as he always had, that she would answer quickly, ready to smooth over whatever crisis he presented her with. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail, her recorded voice calm and familiar, offering no hint of the resolve behind her decision. He tried again, voicemail, a third time, voicemail. He texted her, his messages growing shorter and more clipped with each attempt. "What is this? Call me." "Maya, this is ridiculous, call me back. I don't know what you think you heard, but you're overreacting." No response came. Daniel moved through the house slowly, room by room, cataloging what was missing the way a person assesses damage after a storm. Her side of the closet was empty. The bathroom shelf that had held her things for 6 years held nothing now but his own razor and a half-empty bottle of cologne. The framed photo of her parents was gone from the hallway, leaving a faint rectangular shadow on the wall where sunlight had faded the paint around it for years. He sat down heavily on the edge of their bed, the note still clutched in his hand, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Daniel Whitfield felt something close to fear. His mind, trained by years of business strategy, tried immediately to find an angle, a way to fix the problem the way he fixed every problem, through action, through momentum. He would call her brother. He would drive to her friend Claire's apartment. He would find her and explain calmly that whatever she thought she heard had been taken out of context, that of course she mattered, that of course she was not a liability. But even as he formed these plans, a small, honest part of him, the part he rarely allowed himself to listen to, understood that he had, in fact, said exactly what she believed he said, in exactly the tone she believed he used. He remembered the conversation with Peter now, the offhand cruelty of it, the way he had dismissed 6 years of quiet support with a single careless sentence, eager to appear independent in front of a business partner whose opinion, in the grand scheme of his life, mattered far less than the woman he had just described as expendable. He called Peter instead, needing to speak to someone, needing to hear a voice that might offer some reassurance. "Maya's gone," Daniel said, the words strange and unfamiliar in his mouth. "She left. She heard us talking that day in my office about her being a liability." There was a pause on the line, long enough that Daniel almost thought the call had dropped. "That's rough, man," Peter finally said, though his voice carried more discomfort than genuine sympathy. "You think she'll come around?" "I don't know," Daniel admitted, and the admission cost him something, a small crack in the confident armor he wore like a second skin. "She's not answering her phone." "Give her space," Peter suggested, already sounding distracted, his attention drifting toward whatever task waited on his own desk. She'll cool off. Women get emotional about this stuff, you know how it is. Daniel wanted to believe that, wanted to believe this was simply an emotional overreaction that time would soften. But some quieter, more honest part of him recognized the calm precision of Maya's departure for what it truly was. She had not left in a fit of rage, throwing things, screaming accusations. She had left with the same quiet competence she brought to everything else in her life, taking exactly what belonged to her, leaving behind exactly what did not, waiting a simple, honest note beneath the mug she had bought him years ago at a farmer's market. He barely remembered, but she clearly had not forgotten. That kind of departure was not something a person cooled down from and reversed. That kind of departure was final. He spent the rest of the evening trying every avenue he could think of. He called Ethan, Maya's brother, who answered coolly and offered nothing beyond a brief, measured statement that Maya was safe and did not wish to speak with him at this time. He drove to Claire's apartment, only to find no one answering the door, though he suspected correctly that Claire was inside and simply choosing not to open it. He sat in his car outside her building for nearly an hour, staring at lit windows, wondering which one, if any, belonged to the friend who had clearly helped orchestrate his wife's disappearance from his life. By midnight, exhausted and increasingly desperate, Daniel returned to his empty house and sat once more at the kitchen table, the note now smoothed flat in front of him, reading it for perhaps the 20th time, searching for some loophole, some detail he had missed that might make this all reversible. He thought about calling his mother, Margaret, a woman who had never fully approved of the pace at which Daniel pursued his ambitions, often warning him gently that a person could not build a life entirely on momentum, that eventually a foundation mattered more than speed. He decided against the call, unwilling to hear whatever quiet disappointment she would express, however lovingly intended. Instead, he opened his laptop and pulled up the calendar for Whitfield Logistics, hoping the familiar structure of deadlines and meetings might offer some distraction from the unfamiliar chaos unfolding in his personal life. But even here, small cracks were beginning to show, cracks he had not noticed before because Maya had always quietly filled them before they widened into problems. He found an email from Olivia Grant. The client Peter had been worried about losing, informing him that her company would not be renewing its contract after all, citing a lack of personal attention over the past several months. Daniel stared at the message, trying to remember the last time he had personally called Olivia, and realized, with a discomfort he could not quite name, that Maya had been the one who maintained that relationship for years, sending thoughtful notes on anniversaries of the account, remembering small details about Olivia's family that made the business relationship feel personal rather than transactional. He had not noticed her doing this work because it had always simply been done, quietly, in the background, the way sunlight simply appears each morning without anyone questioning its source. Now the sun had not risen, and Daniel Whitfield was beginning, slowly and painfully, to understand exactly how much darkness that absence would bring. He closed the laptop and sat alone in the silent kitchen, the ceramic mug still sitting where Maya had left it. And for the first time since reading her note, he allowed himself to feel not just fear, but genuine grief, a recognition, however incomplete, of exactly what he had dismissed with 6 careless words in a glass office with the door left open just an inch. It was, he would later realize, the first honest feeling he had allowed himself in years. It arrived far too late to change anything. The weeks that followed tested Daniel Whitfield in ways he had never anticipated, revealing, piece by piece, exactly how much of his success had rested on foundations he had never bothered to examine. The first real blow came 3 days after Maya left, when the supplier deal he had traveled to Chicago to secure fell apart over a minor contract detail, a clause about delivery timelines that Maya, in years past, would have caught and flagged before the paperwork ever reached a signature stage. Daniel had always relied on her sharp eye for detail, often joking to colleagues that she could spot a mistake in a document from across the room. He had never considered what would happen to his contracts once that eye was no longer watching over his shoulder. The supplier's representative called to withdraw the offer, citing concerns about the company's attention to detail, a phrase that landed on Daniel like a small, precise wound. He tried to salvage the deal, offering revised terms, promising closer oversight, but the damage had already spread through the supplier's decision-makers, who preferred, in the end, to work with a company that seemed more organized. Peter Lang, when informed of the lost deal, responded with the kind of casual frustration that Daniel was only now beginning to recognize as a pattern rather than an occasional lapse. "This is exactly why we needed to move fast on the pitch deck redesign," Peter said, tapping his pen against his desk. "We can't afford these kinds of mistakes if we want serious investors." Daniel wanted to point out that the mistake in question was precisely the kind of thing Maya had always caught before it became a problem, but something in him resisted admitting that out loud, even now, even after everything. Pride, he realized later, had cost him more in those first few weeks than almost anything else. The second blow came with the Meridian account, a long-standing client relationship that Daniel had always considered stable, secure, one of the pillars of Whitfield Logistics' revenue. He learned during a routine check-in call that Meridian's primary contact, a woman named Rachel Doyle, had been quietly considering other logistics partners for months, frustrated by what she described as inconsistent communication and a noticeable drop in the personal attention her account used to receive. "We used to get handwritten notes around the holidays," Rachel said during the call, her tone more disappointed than angry. "Little things, but they mattered. Lately it feels like we're just another line item to your company." Daniel promised improvements, promised a dedicated account manager, promised anything he could think of to keep the relationship intact. But he understood, even as he made these promises, that he was scrambling to replicate something Maya had built organically over years, something rooted in genuine attentiveness rather than strategic damage control. Whatever he offered now would feel, and likely was, hollow by comparison. Within 2 weeks, Meridian formally notified Whitfield Logistics of their intent to transition to a competitor, a loss that represented nearly 15% of the company's annual revenue. Peter, upon hearing the news, did not bother to hide his frustration this time. "What is going on with you lately?" Peter demanded during an emergency meeting in the glass office, the same office where 6 weeks earlier Daniel had dismissed his wife as a liability. "We're losing accounts left and right. Investors are asking questions. If this keeps up, we're not going to have a company left to pitch." Daniel, exhausted from weeks of sleepless nights and mounting stress, felt something inside him crack under the pressure of Peter's words. "Maybe if you'd actually pulled your weight on client relationships instead of leaving everything to me," and he stopped himself abruptly, the sentence trailing into silence. "Instead of leaving everything to who?" Peter asked, his eyebrows raised, sensing the unfinished thought. Daniel did not answer. He could not bring himself to say her name out loud, could not bring himself to admit, even now, exactly how much of the company's quiet success had depended on a woman he had once called a liability in this very room. That night, alone in the house that felt increasingly foreign without Maya's presence, Daniel sat down and, for the first time since her departure, attempted to methodically review the true scope of what she had contributed to the business. He pulled up old email threads, searching her name, and found himself scrolling through years of correspondence he had never fully registered before. Thank you notes to vendors, thoughtful check-ins with long-standing clients, careful negotiations that had smoothed over conflicts before they ever reached his desk. He found an email from 18 months earlier, sent from Maya's personal account to a shipping contact named Priya Malhotra, gently asking for a favor, a slightly expedited timeline on a container shipment that had saved Whitfield Logistics from a costly penalty clause with one of their earliest clients. He had never known about that email. He had simply assumed at the time that the timeline had worked out through his own negotiation skills. Piece by piece, the picture became undeniable. Maya had not simply supported his ambition from the sidelines. She had been quietly, consistently, essential to the actual functioning of the business he had built, weaving herself into its foundations so seamlessly that her contributions had become invisible even to him, mistaken for the natural, effortless success of his own hard work. He thought of the words he had said to Peter that day, words he could no longer fully remember the reasoning behind, though he remembered clearly the casual cruelty of his tone. "She's just a liability." He had said it to appear strong, independent, worthy of respect in front of a business partner whose respect, he now understood with growing bitterness, had never been worth the cost. The financial pressure mounted quickly after the Meridian account loss. Investors who had previously expressed interest in a new funding round grew hesitant, unsettled by the sudden instability in the company's client base. Peter began distancing himself, spending more time in meetings Daniel was not invited to, a shift Daniel noticed but felt powerless to address, too consumed by the growing chaos in both his professional and personal life to fight for a partnership that had always, in truth, been built on shakier ground than he wanted to admit. He tried calling Maya again during this period several times, though her number had changed by the second week, a small, deliberate act of distance that stung more than he expected. He sent messages to her personal email instead, careful, measured messages that attempted, clumsily, to express regret without fully understanding what he was apologizing for. "I know I hurt you," one message read. "I want to talk, to understand, to fix this if it can be fixed." Maya did not respond to any of them, not out of cruelty, though Daniel, in his more self-pitying moments, occasionally framed it that way to himself. She simply understood, with a clarity that had grown stronger every day since her departure, that engaging with him now, before he had truly reckoned with what he had done, would only invite the same patterns she had spent 6 years accommodating. Meanwhile, word of the marital separation began quietly circulating through their small professional circle. Carried by whispered conversations at industry events, Daniel could no longer bring himself to attend with his old confidence. Colleagues who had once admired his sharp, ambitious rise now regarded him with a kind of cautious curiosity, wondering what had truly happened behind the closed doors of a marriage that had, from the outside, always appeared solid. His mother, Margaret, finally called him one evening, having heard the news through a mutual family friend rather than from Daniel himself, a fact that added its own quiet sting to an already painful conversation. "I always liked Maya," Margaret said carefully, her voice gentle but unmistakably direct. "I always thought she saw something in you worth building a life around. I hope, whatever happened, you understand what you're losing before it's too late to understand it at all." Daniel, sitting alone in his darkened living room, phone pressed to his ear, found he had no adequate response. He simply thanked his mother for calling and promised, vaguely, to keep her updated, though he understood, even as he said it, that he had very little real understanding of his own situation to offer anyone, least of all himself. The business continued its slow decline over the following weeks, each new setback compounding the last. A slow unraveling that Daniel, for the first time in his adult life, felt entirely unable to control through sheer effort and momentum alone. He was learning, in the hardest possible way, that some foundations cannot be rebuilt through willpower once the quiet hands that first laid them have chosen to walk away. By the second month after Maya's departure, Whitfield Logistics stood on ground so unstable that even Daniel, with all his practiced confidence, could no longer pretend the company was simply weathering a rough patch. The final funding round he had spent the better part of a year preparing for collapsed entirely when the lead investor, a private equity firm that had seemed eager to commit just weeks earlier, sent a brief, formal email citing concerns about recent client attrition and what they described as inconsistent leadership stability. Daniel read the email 3 times in his glass office, the same office where his careless words had first set everything into motion, before setting his phone down and staring out at the parking lot below, empty, except for a handful of cars belonging to employees who had not yet started looking for new positions elsewhere. Peter Lang did not take the news well. He arrived at the office an hour after the investor's email went out, his usual easy confidence replaced by something sharper, more accusatory. "This is a disaster," Peter said, pacing in front of Daniel's desk. "Do you understand what this means? Without that funding round, we can't cover the new office lease past the next 2 quarters. We're going to have to make cuts, serious ones." "I understand exactly what it means," Daniel said, his voice quieter than Peter had ever heard it, drained of the assured energy that had once defined every conversation between them. "Do you?" Peter pressed, something bitter creeping into his tone. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like ever since Maya left, this whole company has been falling apart. Clients leaving, deals collapsing, investors getting cold feet. I hate to say it, Daniel, but maybe she was carrying more of this than either of us wanted to admit." The words landed with a particular kind of pain, precisely because Daniel recognized their truth even as pride urged him to reject them outright. He thought of the phrase Peter had once laughed along with so easily months ago in this very office. "She's just a liability." It felt now like a phrase spoken by a stranger, someone Daniel barely recognized, someone who had mistaken quiet, essential support for expendable weakness. "Don't," Daniel said finally, his voice low but firm. "Don't talk about her like that, not after everything." Peter raised his hands in mock surrender, though his expression remained hard, calculating. "Fine, but we still have a business to save, or what's left of one. I think it's time we talk seriously about restructuring, maybe bringing in new leadership, someone the investors will actually trust." The implication was clear enough that Daniel did not need it spelled out further. Peter was maneuvering, quietly and efficiently, to position himself as the more stable partner, the one investors could rely on, while Daniel's personal life continued to unravel in ways that made him, in Peter's calculating assessment, a liability of his own. The irony was not lost on Daniel, though it offered him no comfort. He had once used that exact word to describe the person who had done more to build this company's quiet stability than anyone else involved, including himself. Now he understood, with a clarity that arrived far too late, precisely how it felt to be seen that way by someone he had trusted. Over the following weeks, Peter's maneuvering became increasingly overt. He began scheduling client calls without informing Daniel in advance, positioning himself as the primary point of contact for the company's remaining major accounts. He held private conversations with the 2 junior employees Whitfield Logistics still employed, conversations Daniel only learned about secondhand, through the kind of office whispers that spread faster than any formal announcement. Daniel, exhausted from months of mounting personal and professional collapse, found himself with less and less energy to fight for control of a company that increasingly felt like it belonged to someone else, built on a foundation he had never fully understood or appreciated until it crumbled beneath him. He tried, during this period, to rebuild some of what had been lost. He personally called Rachel Doyle at Meridian, attempting a final effort to salvage the relationship, only to learn that Meridian had already signed with a competitor 2 weeks earlier. He reached out to Olivia Grant as well, offering discounted rates, expedited service, anything he could think of to win back the accounts Maya had once maintained so effortlessly. Olivia was polite but firm in her decline, mentioning, almost as an aside, that she had always appreciated dealing directly with Maya, whose attention to detail and genuine warmth had made the business relationship feel personal in a way it no longer did. Each rejection added another layer to the growing understanding settling over Daniel, like a slow, cold weight. He had spent years believing his own ambition, his own sharp instincts, had built Whitfield Logistics into a company worth investing in. In truth, his ambition had provided the vision, but Maya's quiet, consistent labor had provided the trust that made that vision sustainable. Without her, the vision alone was proving insufficient to hold the structure together. At home, the isolation deepened in its own way. Daniel found himself sitting alone most evenings in a house that had once felt full, even during Maya's busiest days, simply because her presence had filled it with a warmth he had never consciously appreciated until it was gone. He stopped cooking real meals, relying instead on takeout eaten standing at the kitchen counter, avoiding the dining table where he and Maya had shared 6 years of dinners, conversations, quiet partnership he had taken entirely for granted. He reached out to his mother more frequently during this period, conversations that offered little comfort but at least broke the silence that otherwise dominated his evenings. Margaret, for her part, remained gentle but unflinchingly honest. "You built a company on the idea that you could do everything yourself," she told him during one call, her voice carrying the particular patience of a mother who had watched her son's ambition outpace his wisdom for years. "But nobody does anything entirely alone, Daniel. The people who succeed longest are the ones who recognize the hands helping to hold them up, and who make sure those hands know they're valued." Daniel absorbed the words without responding immediately, staring at the ceramic mug still sitting on his kitchen counter, the same mug Maya had waited her final note beneath weeks earlier. He had never moved it, had left it in that exact spot as though moving it might somehow make her departure feel more permanent than it already was. The final blow to the company came 3 weeks later, when Peter Lang informed Daniel, in a brief, businesslike meeting that felt more like a formal notification than a conversation between partners, that he intended to leave Whitfield Logistics and start a new venture of his own, taking with him 2 of the company's remaining smaller accounts, and more damagingly, the confidence of what few investors still remained interested in the company's future. "It's just business, Daniel," Peter said, avoiding real eye contact as he delivered the news. "You understand how this works. I have to protect my own interests." Daniel understood, with a bitterness that tasted uncomfortably familiar, that this was simply Peter applying the same cold, transactional logic Daniel himself had once applied to his own marriage, the logic that measured relationships purely by their usefulness in the moment, discarding anything that no longer served an immediate purpose. Within a month of Peter's departure, Whitfield Logistics closed its doors entirely. The glass office building Daniel had once been so proud of standing empty, a for lease sign posted in the window facing the parking lot where Maya had once sat frozen in her car, absorbing the full weight of the words that had, in the end, cost Daniel everything he had spent years building. He stood outside the building on the day the final paperwork was signed, staring up at the glass facade reflecting the pale afternoon sky, and allowed himself, for the first time since Maya's departure, to fully grieve not just the loss of his marriage, but the loss of a version of himself he had once believed was strong enough to succeed entirely on his own terms, without acknowledging the quiet, essential support that had made his success possible in the first place. The lesson, when it finally arrived in full, unavoidable clarity. But by then, as with so many lessons learned too late, there was very little left for Daniel to do with the understanding except carry it forward, alone, into whatever came next. 3 months after Maya walked out of their shared home, Daniel Whitfield sat in a small coffee shop across town, waiting for a meeting he had spent nearly 2 weeks working up the courage to request. He had reached out through Nathan Price, Maya's attorney, after months of unanswered calls and messages, asking not for reconciliation, though a part of him still quietly hoped for it, but simply for a chance to speak with her directly, face to face, without lawyers or intermediaries standing between them. To his surprise, Maya had agreed, on the condition that the meeting take place in public, brief, and clearly bounded. She arrived precisely on time, dressed simply, her posture carrying a kind of settled confidence Daniel did not immediately recognize. The Maya who sat down across from him now seemed different from the woman he had left behind 3 months earlier, though he could not immediately articulate what exactly had changed. It was not her appearance, though she looked well-rested in a way she had not for years. It was something quieter, something in the way she held herself, unhurried, unbothered by his presence in a way that struck him as entirely new. "Thank you for coming," Daniel said, his voice carrying none of the easy confidence that had once defined him in every conversation. "I said I would," Maya replied simply, ordering a tea from the passing server before turning her full attention to him. "You wanted to talk." "I'm listening." Daniel had rehearsed this moment countless times over the preceding weeks, imagining various speeches, various apologies, various explanations for the words she had overheard that day in his office. Sitting across from her now, all of it evaporated, leaving only the plain, uncomfortable truth he had been avoiding for months. "I lost the company," he said finally. "Whitfield Logistics closed last month. Peter left, took 2 of our remaining accounts with him. The investors pulled out. Everything I built, it's gone." Maya's expression remained calm, neither triumphant nor particularly surprised. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said, and she meant it honestly, without any trace of satisfaction in his failure, a fact that unsettled Daniel more than anger would have. "I've had a lot of time to think," Daniel continued, choosing his words carefully. "About what I said, about how I treated you, about everything I never acknowledged you did for that company, for us, for years. I didn't understand how much I depended on you until you were gone. I know that doesn't excuse anything, but I wanted you to know I finally understand it." Maya listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful, giving nothing away. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, stirring her tea slowly before she finally spoke. "Daniel, I believe you understand it now," she said. "I can see that this has cost you something real, and I'm not without compassion for that. But I need you to understand something too. I spent 6 years hoping you would recognize my value without needing to lose everything first. I hoped it while I was covering payroll gaps in your early years. I hoped it while I sat quietly through meetings where you introduced me as your assistant. I hoped it through every late night. I helped you rebuild pitch decks you couldn't afford to have professionally done. That hope wore itself thin long before I ever heard you say those words to Peter. What I heard that day didn't create the problem. It just finally gave me permission to stop pretending the problem didn't exist." Daniel absorbed her words in silence, the truth of them settling over him with a weight he could not argue against, even if some old, defensive part of him still wanted to. "Is there any chance," he began carefully, "that we could try again, now that I understand things differently?" Maya set down her tea, meeting his eyes directly, her voice gentle but entirely certain. "I don't think so, Daniel, not because I don't believe you're sorry. I think you are, genuinely, in this moment. But understanding what you lost isn't the same as becoming the kind of person who wouldn't have lost it in the first place. I spent 6 years being someone's quiet support system, and I'm only now learning what it feels like to build a life centered around my own voice, my own choices, my own value. I'm not willing to set that down again, not even for the version of you sitting in front of me today, genuinely remorseful as you seem." The words landed with a finality Daniel had not fully prepared himself for, though some honest part of him had suspected, walking into the coffee shop, that this was exactly the answer he would receive. "I understand," he said quietly, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he genuinely did. There was no anger left in him to argue against her decision, only a clear, sobering recognition that he had forfeited something irreplaceable through years of careless assumption, and that recognition, however painful, was arriving exactly when and how it deserved to. "What will you do now?" Maya asked, her tone softening slightly, curiosity replacing the firm boundary she had just established. Daniel considered the question honestly. "I'm not entirely sure yet. I've had some conversations about consulting work, helping smaller companies avoid the mistakes I made. It feels strange, teaching people about stability and partnership when I clearly failed at both. But maybe that's exactly why I'd be useful. I understand now, in a way I didn't before, what it actually costs to overlook the people who make success possible." Maya nodded slowly, something that might have been respect, quiet and measured, crossing her expression. "That sounds like real growth, Daniel. I hope you follow through on it for your own sake, not because you owe it to me." "And you?" Daniel asked, "What's next for you?" For the first time since sitting down, something warm crossed Maya's face, an expression Daniel had not seen directed at him in longer than he could remember, though he understood, watching it, that it was not truly meant for him at all. It was simply the natural expression of a woman speaking about a future she was genuinely excited to build. "I've gone back into logistics work, full-time," she said, An old colleague brought me on to help restructure operations for a growing freight company. It turns out 6 years of quiet behind-the-scenes work translates rather well into a formal career, once someone finally puts my name on the org chart instead of leaving it off entirely. There was no bitterness in the observation, only a kind of clear-eyed acknowledgement of the past, spoken from a place of security rather than lingering pain. I'm good at it, Daniel. I always was. I just spent a long time believing that being good at something only mattered if it helped someone else succeed. Daniel absorbed the quiet strength in her words, understanding, perhaps for the first time with full clarity, exactly what he had dismissed so carelessly months earlier in a glass office he no longer owned. The woman sitting across from him was not, and had never been, a liability. She had been the steady, essential foundation beneath everything he had built, and he had been too consumed by his own ambition to recognize her value until the entire structure collapsed without her. They spoke for a few more minutes, mostly practical matters related to the remaining legal separation of their shared finances, before Maya rose to leave, her posture calm and unhurried, entirely her own. "Thank you for being honest with me today," Daniel said as she gathered her things. "I know you didn't owe me that." "I didn't do it for you," Maya said simply, though not unkindly. "I did it because I wanted to close this chapter clearly for myself. I hope you find whatever peace comes next, Daniel. I truly do." She paused at the door, glancing back once. "Just make sure, whatever you build next, you build it with people who know they matter. Don't wait until you lose them to understand what they were worth." She left the coffee shop without waiting for a response, walking out into the bright afternoon sun with the easy, settled confidence of a woman who had already found her footing in a life entirely her own, leaving Daniel alone at the small table, holding the full, undeniable weight of everything he had learned too late to change. A year after walking out of the house she had once called home, Maya Bennett stood in front of a small conference room full of new hires at Halloway Freight Solutions, the growing company where Priya Malhotra had brought her on as director of operations, and realized, with a quiet sense of wonder, how completely her life had transformed since the afternoon she froze in a hallway listening to words that were never meant to reach her ears. The apartment Claire had helped her find in those first uncertain weeks had long since become a real home, decorated slowly and deliberately over the months, filled with furniture Maya had chosen entirely for herself, without needing to consider anyone else's preferences or convenience. She had painted the walls a warm, soft yellow in the kitchen, a color Daniel had once vetoed years ago in their old house, claiming it was too bright, too unserious for a proper kitchen. Maya had laughed the first time she stood back and admired the finished walls, struck by how such a small, simple choice could feel like such a meaningful act of reclamation. Her career had flourished in ways she had not fully anticipated when she first reached out to Priya during those early, uncertain weeks of separation. Her deep knowledge of logistics, sharpened over years of quietly managing Daniel's business without any formal recognition, translated seamlessly into her new role, where her contributions were not only acknowledged but actively celebrated. Within 8 months, she had been promoted twice, eventually taking on a leadership position that placed her name, finally, clearly, on documents and org charts and public-facing materials. No longer an invisible hand working behind someone else's ambition, but a recognized professional building a reputation entirely her own. She thought of Daniel occasionally, though less and less as the months passed, the memory of their marriage settling into something manageable, no longer sharp enough to cause real pain, simply a chapter of her life she had lived through and grown beyond. She had heard, through mutual acquaintances who still occasionally crossed paths with her former circle, that Daniel had taken up consulting work, helping small business owners navigate early growth challenges, apparently drawing on hard-won lessons from his own company's collapse. She hoped, genuinely, that the work brought him some measure of peace and self-awareness, though she no longer felt any particular need to track his progress closely or measure her own healing against his. Claire remained her closest friend, and the two of them had developed a standing tradition of Sunday dinners, taking turns cooking elaborate meals in each other's apartments. filling the evenings with the kind of easy, unguarded laughter that had felt increasingly rare during Maya's final years of marriage. Ethan visited often as well, bringing his young daughter along on weekends, and Maya found herself surprised by how naturally joy had returned to her life, once she stopped organizing every hour around someone else's needs and ambitions. She had begun dating again recently, cautiously, without urgency, meeting a soft-spoken architect named Julian Hayes through a mutual friend at one of Priya's dinner parties. Their relationship remained new, still finding its shape, but Maya appreciated, more than almost anything else about it, the way Julian asked genuine questions about her work, listened with real attention when she described complex operational challenges at Holloway Freight, and never once made her feel as though her professional accomplishments were secondary to his own ambitions. It was a small thing, perhaps, to an outside observer, but to Maya, who had spent 6 years learning to shrink her own presence to accommodate someone else's growth, it felt like an entirely new way of existing within a relationship, one built on equal footing rather than quiet sacrifice. On a bright Saturday morning, nearly 14 months after she had first overheard Daniel's careless words through a barely open office door, Maya stood on the small balcony of her apartment, coffee in hand, watching the city wake up around her, and allowed herself a moment of genuine reflection on everything the past year had taught her. She had learned that walking away quietly, without spectacle or prolonged conflict, had not been a sign of weakness, as she had briefly feared it might appear to others, but rather the clearest possible expression of self-respect she had ever demonstrated in her adult life. She had learned that the skills and instincts she had spent years pouring into someone else's success were entirely her own, transferable, valuable, deserving of recognition on their own merits, independent of whose ambition they had once served. And she had learned, perhaps most importantly, that the version of herself capable of building an entire life from nothing but careful planning, quiet courage, and the support of people who genuinely valued her, had been present within her all along, simply waiting for the right moment to step forward and take the lead. Daniel Whitfield, in his own quieter, more difficult way, continued rebuilding his life from the wreckage of assumptions he had once held too tightly. He worked now from a small home office, far removed from the glass-fronted building that had once represented his early ambitions, guiding a handful of small business clients through the same lessons he had learned at devastating personal cost. He kept still on the corner of his desk, the small ceramic mug Maya had left behind on that final morning, not out of any lingering hope for reconciliation, which he had come, slowly, to accept was neither possible nor fair to ask for, but as a quiet, permanent reminder of the cost of taking essential people for granted. He had begun, in recent months, mentoring young entrepreneurs specifically on the importance of recognizing and properly valuing the people who supported their growth, whether business partners, employees, or spouses, weaving his own painful story into his guidance not as a cautionary tale meant to elicit sympathy, but as an honest acknowledgement of a mistake he hoped others might avoid making in their own lives. It was, he often told the young founders who sought his advice, the most valuable lesson his failed business had ever taught him, far more important than any strategy for securing funding or scaling operations quickly. Build with people who matter, and make certain they always know it. Everything else, in the end, depends on getting that one thing right. Maya never learned the full extent of Daniel's efforts to change, nor did she particularly need to. Her life had moved forward, fully and completely, into a future built entirely on her own terms, populated by people who recognized her worth freely, without requiring loss or crisis to reveal it. The quiet walk she had taken away from a life that no longer valued her had become, in the fullness of time, the single most important decision she had ever made for herself. A decision that asked for no applause, no dramatic confrontation, no permission from anyone but her own steady, resolved heart. She had simply, quietly walked away, and in doing so she had found everything Daniel had once dismissed as unnecessary, everything he had spent 6 careless words giving away without understanding its true worth. she had found herself. 2 years after the door of a glass office had been left open just an inch wide enough to change two lives forever, Maya Bennett stood at the front of a small industry conference, delivering a keynote on operational resilience to a room full of logistics professionals who had specifically requested her insight after hearing about her rapid rise within Halloway Freight Solutions. She spoke with the same quiet confidence that had once helped stitch together an entire company behind the scenes. Only now that confidence belonged fully and visibly to her, unshared, unclaimed by anyone else's ambition. After the talk, a young woman approached her during the networking reception, nervous and earnest, explaining that she worked long, unpaid hours supporting her partner's growing business, unsure whether her contributions truly mattered or whether she was simply making herself easy to overlook. Maya recognized, immediately and completely, the particular kind of quiet uncertainty in the young woman's voice, the same uncertainty she herself had carried for years without fully naming it. "Document everything," Maya told her gently, choosing her words with the care of someone who understood exactly how much those words might matter later. "Keep records of what you contribute, financially and otherwise. Not because you expect the relationship to fail, but because you deserve clarity about your own value, regardless of how anyone else chooses to see it. And watch closely for the moments when someone shows you, plainly, how they truly regard your presence in their life. Believe those moments. Don't explain them away." The young woman thanked her, visibly moved, and Maya watched her walk back into the crowded reception hall with a small, private hope that her words might spare someone else the particular pain of discovering their own invisibility only through an overheard, careless sentence. Daniel Whitfield, meanwhile, had built a modest but genuinely respected consulting practice over those same 2 years, one grounded firmly in the hard lessons of his own collapse. He no longer chased rapid growth or investor approval as the primary measures of success, having learned, through devastating personal experience, that sustainable achievement depended far more on trust, partnership, and honest recognition of shared effort than on any single individual's ambition, however sharp or determined. He remained unmarried, uncertain whether he would ever fully trust himself again with a partnership as significant as the one he had once carelessly discarded, though he had, slowly and deliberately, built genuine friendships and professional relationships grounded in the kind of mutual respect he had failed to offer for far too long. He occasionally received updates about Maya's continued success, always second-hand, always met with a complicated mixture of pride and quiet grief. Pride for the thriving life she had built entirely apart from him, grief for the version of their future he had once imagined and permanently forfeited through his own careless words. He never reached out again after their single meeting in the coffee shop, understanding fully, finally, that some doors, once closed with such clear and deliberate calm, were not meant to be reopened, regardless of how genuinely a person's understanding might grow after the fact. The story of Maya's quiet departure and Daniel's subsequent collapse eventually circulated, in fragmented form, through their old professional circle, transforming gradually from private gossip into something closer to cautionary folklore, repeated among ambitious young professionals as a reminder of what genuine partnership actually requires. Few people knew the full details, the overheard conversation, the careful weeks of quiet planning, the single folded note left beneath a ceramic mug on an otherwise empty kitchen counter. But the essential truth of the story traveled regardless, carried forward by people who recognized, in its outline, a warning worth remembering. Maya herself rarely spoke publicly about the specifics of her marriage, preferring to let her professional accomplishments speak for themselves, rather than defining her story through the lens of what she had once endured and ultimately overcome. But privately, in quiet conversations with close friends, with Claire over their continuing Sunday dinners, with Ethan during long weekend visits, she remained honest about the journey, unafraid to acknowledge both the pain of those early days and the genuine strength she had discovered within herself through the process of rebuilding. On the second anniversary of the day she had walked out of her old life, quietly, deliberately, without spectacle. Maya sat on her balcony once more, watching the same city lights she had watched that very first uncertain night in her new apartment, and found herself filled not with lingering bitterness toward the past, but with a settled, hard-won gratitude for exactly how far she had traveled since then. She thought of the woman she had been that final morning, frozen in a hallway, coffee going cold in her hand, listening to words that had threatened to define her entire worth in a single careless sentence. She thought of how easily she might have stayed, might have argued, might have demanded an apology and accepted a hollow promise of change, settling once more into the familiar shape of quiet accommodation. She was grateful, deeply and permanently grateful, that she had chosen instead the harder, quieter path of simply walking away, trusting her own judgment enough to build an entirely new life on the strength of her own two hands. Julian joined her on the balcony that evening, settling beside her with 2 cups of tea, asking gently what she was thinking about with such quiet focus. Maya smiled, leaning into the warmth of a partnership built entirely on equal footing, on genuine mutual respect, on the kind of steady, unspectacular trust she had once believed she already possessed, only to discover, through painful experience, exactly how absent it had truly been. "Just remembering how far I've come," she said simply, resting her head against his shoulder as the city lights spread out before them, endless and glittering, full of quiet, ordinary possibility. "And being grateful, I finally learned my own worth, even though it took losing everything to see it clearly." Somewhere across the city, in a small home office cluttered with papers and a single ceramic mug that had never been used again since the morning it held down a folded note of quiet, permanent departure, Daniel Whitfield continued the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding a life grounded, finally, in genuine humility. He would never fully recover what he had lost, and he had, by then, made a kind of uneasy peace with that permanent absence. But he carried forward, into every new relationship and every piece of advice he offered to eager young entrepreneurs, the hardest and most valuable lesson his failure had ever taught him. Some people spend their lives searching for the exact moment everything changed, the single decision that altered the entire trajectory of their story. For Daniel, that moment would always remain a glass office door, left open just an inch, and 6 careless words spoken to impress a business partner who, in the end, mattered far less than the woman those words so thoughtlessly discarded. For Maya, the moment was different. It was not the sentence itself that changed her life, though it had certainly been the spark. It was the quiet, deliberate choice she made in the days that followed, the choice to trust her own worth enough to walk away without asking permission, without demanding an apology, without waiting for someone else to finally see her clearly. She had simply quietly chosen herself, and in doing so she had found a life entirely, unmistakably her own.